Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the many different forms of Protestant church government. I feel like there's a lot of explanations of the Catholic or Orthodox church polity, but not too many talking about Protestants. And one of the many things all the different Protestant traditions disagree about, church polity is one of the biggest ones, with almost every major mainline Protestant tradition having a pretty different interpretation on how to have church government and how to run the church. So when we look at Protestant church government, there's about three different categories. The first one being Episcopal. So who better to talk about the Episcopal groups, who better to start with, at least, than the Episcopalians? So the Episcopalians, first of all, Episcopal means bishop-led. And the Episcopalians, with their Episcopal government, are pretty close to Catholics. The Archbishop of Canterbury is their first among equals within the Anglican Communion. And when the Anglican Communion has their Lambeth Conference and meet globally, the Archbishop of Canterbury might lead symbolically, but they have no real binding authority. The bishops oversee different dioceses and ordain the clergy. A diocese is the regional authority structure. The diocese is the regional authority structure within the Episcopal Church. And the bishops can also ordain clergy. Your parish is a part of a diocese, which would be in a bishop's jurisdiction. And the General Convention shapes worship and theology within the Episcopal Church, but it kind of stops in America. This is because within the Anglican Communion, every church is autonomous. So moving on from the Anglicans, our second Episcopal polity is the connectional polity of the Methodist tradition. So within the connectional polity, we have a general conference that is the highest authority in the Methodist tradition. Bishops have a bit less power than in the Episcopal Church, but they still enforce the general conference's authority. And within Methodism, pastors get appointed to churches by the bishops, and the bishops enforce the decisions made by the general conference. Past that, we have different connections that happen, and those connections function as basically synods. We don't have synods in Methodism, but those little connectional meetings is essentially our version of a synod. So the last Episcopal polity is the Lutherans. And they have a very modified Episcopal polity, almost closer to the Reformed Presbyterian church polity, but we'll get there. So the first and biggest difference is that the pastor doesn't get appointed anywhere by the bishop. The congregation picks a pastor, and the bishop helps to oversee it and make sure everything goes smoothly. Of the three Episcopal models, Lutherans give bishops the least amount of authority. Instead, they have synods, which carry a lot more power to oversee and correct. The highest synod is the church-wide assembly. Now, bishops oversee the synods, and the synods are governing and binding, but the individual bishop doesn't have nearly as much power. So also operating on councils and synods, we have the Presbyterian church polity. The Presbyterian church is almost exclusively ruled by councils. It's a pretty big thing for them. This is another place where Calvin's hyperfixation on structure really comes to show. So the highest council is the General Assembly. And then you have synods, which are your again, your regional powers, your diocese, if you will. And within the Presbyterian Church, the synods are the groups that historically conducted the heresy trials. Presbyteries are the third kind of little council down, and those oversee ministers and congregations by region. And the lowest council is a session of local presbyters or elders, usually looking over one congregation. The presbyteries have the same role as the bishops to enforce the rule of the General Assembly. And the Presbyterian tradition is the only tradition that has that Reformed Presbyterian church polity. So, the third category of church polity are the congregational polity. And who better to talk about the congregational polity than the Congregationalists? So let's start there. The Congregationalists don't really follow a top-down authority structure. The highest authority is the congregation. Hence the name Congregationalists. They see the fellow churches and their denomination as partners, walking together, and no singular decision can be really forced upon a congregation. And then we have the Baptists, which take that congregational model and then modify it just a tad. So let's start by talking about the ABC USA, which follows a lot closer to the Congregationalist model than the SBC. There are regional and national leaders and conferences, and they really just set the standard of the ABC USA. And any ABC USA church is free to disagree on a lot of those secondary and tertiary issue standards. I believe pretty much all of them. Now, they can exile someone, but it's not nearly as harsh as how they do it in the SBC, which is a little different. While the SBC does maintain that congregational model where no institutional power has direct oversight over an individual congregation, the SBC still does have a very institutional power. So the SBC, all the churches within the SBC tend to consolidate their seminary missions, all this money for all these different projects that the SBC conducts. And if you don't follow the SBC doctrinal standards, the SBC can't necessarily remove a pastor or put a new pastor inside of a congregation. However, the institution can and will expel and cut off a church that doesn't follow those loose doctrinal standards in the SBC. So, that is a very brief, very basic overview of the three different forms of Protestant church government and how the different mainline traditions practice those different forms of government. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like. If you didn't, hit the dislike button twice. And if you want to see more, please subscribe. I am working on a few more of the Protestant figure videos for those in my audience who've been watching for a little bit. But before I get too ahead of myself on those, I realized I keep forgetting in those videos to say, hey, in the comments, put down any Protestant figures that you want me to see talk about. The whole YouTuber thing. So right now I have John Knox I'm kind of working on, and Richard Hooker I'm kind of working on. But if there's any figures that you want to see me do research and talk about, please leave them in the comments, and I will get to work on that. And remember, it doesn't have to be limited to just theologians. I did Spafford, so you are more than free to pick anyone. My only criteria is that they are mainline Protestant. That is the only criteria. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your day. God bless you and your families. This is the Protestant Education signing off.